All right, welcome to class 3. Good job last week. Let's just get into it. All right, so this week what we're doing is we're covering those various elements there, obviously. So we're going to talk about digital cameras. Okay, so this is obviously not a photography class. We actually have photography at the school. I highly suggest taking photography in the VCP program. Our photography department in general is really good. Like it's one of those things like we're kind of actually known for. We offer a variety of photography classes. So we have two intro ones that you could possibly take. We have VCP 101, which is it's a photography class. It's a little more in depth and it's meant for VCP majors. So if you're graphic design or if you're photography or video, whatever, you probably don't want to take that one. If you're just taking this class like you're part of like marketing or something like that, then you could potentially take our other photography class, which is ART 180, and that is actually made for non-majors. So that is a 3-credit course as opposed to the VCP course, which is 4 credit. And what's nice about the ART 180 is that will cover your arts credit. So you have to take like an arts/humanities class, I think, for your degree. And that will actually fill that slot. So I would suggest that. You might not want to take it if like if you're video game design, for instance, because that's one of the things I teach. I would highly suggest just taking drawing courses or what do you call it? Human anatomy drawing. I don't know what they have here, but figure drawing. Those sort of things would be better. But anyway, if you could take photography, it's useful because it talks about composition, which is generally relates to everybody. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is digital versus analog. So this is one of those things that's commonly maybe misunderstood to some degree. So back in the day, we used to have cameras. They were film cameras, and they were analog, meaning that they would be wave-based. Okay, so it just means it uses a wave in order to represent an image or sound or various other things. Okay, the way that digital works is that it will try to approximate that wave by using steps. Okay, so the lower the resolution, right, you can see the less number of pixels it has to work with, the rougher it's going to be. As you get more and more resolution, it becomes closer and closer to the wave, right? And obviously these are all pixels too, but you can get closer and closer to the look of that wave. So audio is a good example. I know I can't really tell the difference, but you'll see some people and they'll be like, oh, I don't like the sound of MP3s because they can hear the compression in it, as opposed to, something that's like a CD or even a record. They'll say that just sounds better because they can see it. But you can see it visually as well. You'll see a low resolution image versus a high resolution image. If you look at old analog photography, I really like the look of it. Even that actually has some resolution dependencies, but I'm not going to get into that. But the idea is that when we're doing digital photography, we're really just kind of mimicking what they would do for, analog photography. All right. Pretty much everything you have now is that. We have a bunch of different varieties of cameras that you can use, right? So there's the point and shoot cameras, which basically look like this thing here. Which you have on your phone is a point and shoot camera. Basically, you have a CCD, you have a photosensitive, charge coupling device on the lens here, and then the light hits it and it creates an image for you and you can see it. That's a little bit different than an SLR, single lens reflex camera, or DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera. So this is the back end, this is the front end. The reason why this is different is that when you take when you're using something like your phone or something like this, the light comes in through the front of the camera here, and then you're seeing an approximation of it on the back. You'll see like an LCD screen on the back of this, but you'll see the LCD screen, or you'll see like your phone, right? If you actually compare that to what the actual photo looks like, they are not the same. I'm sure you've taken photos with your camera, right? Especially if it's like really low lighting. You take a photo, and then what you see is it ends up being like not looking at all like what the live preview was. It's the same idea. The nice thing is when you do a DSLR is that the light comes in through this lens, and the reason why it's called single lens reflex is that inside there is what do you call it, a periscope. There's basically mirrors in here, so the light will come in. There's a mirror on the bottom that reflects the light up, and then there's a mirror on the top here, so it'll go boom, boom, and then out through a lens right here, right? So basically, when you're looking through this eyepiece, you're actually looking through the lens itself. So you actually see what you are shooting in like as live. It's not a digital representation; it's the actual light that's coming through. What happens is when you take the picture, the mirror that's up here will actually flip forward, or I'm sorry, the mirror on the bottom will flip up, and then the light will go through, and instead of going that mirror bouncing it up, the mirror gets out of the way and it allows the light to hit the sensor inside the body of the camera, and then it will expose it forever you adjusted the f-stop for, or the shutter speed. So that's the way it works. That's actually for, in fact, if you have one of these, if you click on it, you'll notice that as you click on it, you won't see anything. It'll just be black for a second because that mirror is flipped up. So generally speaking, these are usually considered a little bit better. There's like newer ones coming out, like the Sony mirrorless, which is what everyone's raging about. Again, it's not a photography class. Just be aware that these are obviously preferred as opposed to this. But to be frank, I mean, the cameras on cell phones these days are really phenomenal. I mean, any of the Apple ones are really good. I have a Samsung phone. I don't think it's that great. The Pixel, the Google Pixel phones do a pretty nice job as well. I think those are pretty good. So, but really, this class is not a photography class, so I'm not going to be too hard up on it. But the main thing is you just need to make sure that you take as good a photo as possible, so that you have a better canvas to work with. Some of your guys' work, when you guys are creating it, it's not even a fault of the work that you're doing inside of Photoshop. It's just the original image is such poor quality that it's just not working as well as it could. Some of the things you would take into account when you are using a DSLR or other things as well are the lenses. Will notice that if you look at your phones, a lot of these, the newer phones now, they actually have multiple lenses. They have multiple cameras on them, and that's how they're able to get better photo quality, because they can't have this big honking piece that will scale, right, that moves in and out. So what they'll do is they just have multiple lenses at different scales, so that way when you take photos far away, it'll use the one. When it's really up close, the macro, it'll use another one, and then it'll have one for mid shot, right? But there's different size lenses that you can use that will allow you to take photos. Basically at different distances, but they have other effects as well. They'll generally flatten an image if it's like a telephoto lens, but you'll be able to get photos from really far away. The main thing I would suggest here is we do have cameras that you can take out. So if for some reason you were like, oh, I really want to do a really good job, you can go to the lab and they will allow you to borrow a camera as long as the lab's open, and then you can take your photos and you just bring it back. The main thing here, though, is do not touch the lens. Like, if you get some splotch on here, don't just use your shirt. They make special wipes and stuff that you can use in order to adjust this. Usually the glass is very sensitive, and you could permanently damage it. And depending on the camera, sometimes the lenses are more expensive than the camera itself. I don't think that's the case for any of our cameras, but I know that can be the case. So just be aware of that. Don't touch the lens. Aperture, this is another thing you can adjust inside of your camera. So the idea with aperture is that it is the inside of here, it's basically the iris of the camera, right? So if you look outside on a bright sunny day, if you look at someone's pupil, you will see the pupil will dilate, right? It'll become really small, because there's a lot of light, so it's trying to restrict the amount of light, and if it's really dark, the pupil will get much larger. That's what the aperture does, and you can kind of adjust for lighting depending on that. So with the aperture, if we use a large aperture, you can get a really nice depth of field, right? So if you can see here, this is in focus and this is not in focus, meaning that the aperture, the hole in the camera is much larger inside the lens. But if you don't do that, if you make a much smaller one, everything will be in focus, and then you will see both things equally, okay? So just be aware of that. The other thing you can do to kind of control the amount of light that comes in is shutter speed. So if you have a slow, if the shutter speed is how long you have the sensor exposed. So if you have a really long shutter speed, like you're exposing the sensor for a really long time, you can end up with a very blurred image. And if you make it really quick, you can end up with capturing a moment, a fast motion. Okay. Now, these are typically the two things you have to work with: shutter speed and aperture. Now, the idea here is that, let's say I'm taking a photo and it's at night, I'm going to have to probably use a large aperture so that I can get as much light into the camera as I can. And I'll probably have to do a slow shutter, right? Now, that's fine as long as nothing's moving. If you have things moving, then you'll end up getting a blurred image. Now, for example, let's say we're trying to do action photography and I'm photographing my kid's little league baseball team, right? Well, if I want to do that, I'm going to want to be able to capture the motion of them, let's say, hitting the ball with the bat, right? So I'm going to have to use a really fast shutter speed. Well, if I'm using a fast shutter speed, it'll make the image darker. So what I'll have to do is then open the aperture, so that I can let more light in at a certain time, right? So that's kind of the idea behind it, is that often you have to kind of compete with these two things. So it sort of depends. So let's say you're trying to take a photo and you want to have a really long shutter. Let's say you're doing a waterfall and you want it to look like, glass, right? Like you want it to look like, you want to be all blurry and look really pretty or something. Well, if you're going to do that, if it's a bright sunny day, you're actually going to have to go through and do a small aperture. So that way you don't let too much light in, because you're going to have it exposed for so long. So usually you have to kind of balance those two. And that's how you do that. Now, another thing you can also use is that the camera has what they call ISO. Basically, it will adjust the sensitivity of the sensor itself. The higher, the faster, the more sensitive you make it, the grainier the photo will be. And you probably have noticed that with your phone, because it relies very heavily. Webcams also rely very heavily on ISO in order to compensate. That should be your last effort. Try to do it through aperture. And the other one, if you are going to be using cameras, again, this isn't a photo class, but I just want you to be aware that these things exist, and you could try adjusting them. You can actually adjust some of these phones. Actually have quite a few adjustments that you can actually make some changes to, even these things, the shutter speed and the aperture, and sometimes the ISO as well. But just be aware, most of the time if you do automatic, you'll probably be fine. But if you do want to try and play around with those, just be aware that those are options. So non-destructive editing, what we've been doing so far, like the last thing we did with the healing, that was basically destructive. I think I've already talked about this, but the idea with non-destructive just means that whenever you're doing anything to the image, it's not going to ruin the original image. That original image, all the pixels remain the same. They are not changed. They're not damaged anyway. You're merely putting layers on top of them, or you're saving the image itself. So a smart object will allow you to store the image, so you can scale it and move it around without having to resample the image. But generally speaking, when possible, you want to work with non-destructive layers. I made a big list of the adjustment layers here, basically describing what each one of them do. So you can look through these if you'd like. I might also cover it in the video down here. Well, we'll see. But just here are all all the adjustment layers that are available to you. There's also the layer blending modes. If you click on this, it's just a Word document, and it'll explain what the different layer blending modes do. Okay. Text. So typography. So when you basically, typography is the study of fonts, of typefaces, of text. Okay, both the anatomy of it as well as the application of it, well as utilizing it. It's sort of both things. If you were in a 4-year graphic design program, they would have you take typography. That is one of the staples of any composition, any typical page layout. I mean, if you look right now, right, text is a huge part of my website. Most websites, text is going to be huge. Any magazine layouts, Instagram posts, right? All these things, they all have typography built into them, and you want to make sure that you understand the rules of those in order to create the best possible type for your work as possible. Couple of things that we could take into account is the letter form here. I'm not going to get too crazy into it, because I'm assuming that they'll probably cover this more in the digital imaging 3. But basically, there is an anatomy to each one of the elements inside of um, the text here, right? So, like for instance, this is called the X height, right? And this is an A sender. This is a D sender. The little feet here, these little nucks are serifs. The little extra little tidbits that kind of come off. So there's a whole. I thought this was a link. Okay, there's a whole lot more that goes to that, but I'm not going to get really into that just because that, like I said, that's a whole class in of itself. What I do want you to be aware of is the fact that you can kind of break type into these classifications, these categories, all right, and each one is valid for different reasons. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over these. So monospace means that every letter of the text is the same width. The reason why this one exists is the original typewriter, right? So if you look at every foot of a typewriter, they have to be the exact same width, because when you're typing, you can't change the size of it, because otherwise some of the when you would hit the button and it would slam the foot against the paper, it might overlap or there might be a gap because they would be different sizes. So they make sure that every time it moves the thing over a little bit, that would move the paper over, that it would be offset the exact same amount. Now, we still use monospace for some things. Typically, you will see that people use it for screenwriting. The reason why they use it for screenwriting is that, in case you don't already know this, when you write a script, that every page of the script is supposed to be equivalent to 1 minute of film, which means if you're making a 1 hour long piece, it would be it would be 60 pages, right? And if you're doing 2 hours, it'd be 120 pages. So one way to make sure that you don't have more or fewer letters in there is that if they're all monospace, you know exactly how many characters are in that, characters meaning each individual letter, are in that page. Okay. It's also useful for coding. So when you're typing out and you're trying to program something, a lot of times when you write the code, you're not worried about how it looks aesthetically. What you're trying to think about is, if I have one line of code and then I have another line of code and they're the exact same thing, I want them to line up if they have the same number of characters. The tabbing and organization of the text is more important than the actual look of it. So you will see it often used for that as well. We don't use it too much. You will see little uses of it used as far as design is concerned, but not too awful much. Now the next one is probably serif. So serif, I mentioned before, have the little nucks. It basically has feet, and those are used for large bodies of text. So normally when we look at this stuff, we typically think of like newspaper, right? Or something printed, or something you're going to read, a book, okay? Believe it or not, like a lot of times people think that this is like the oldest type of font. It's actually sans serif is the oldest. They started adding these extra little bits because what they found was that it was easier for people to read large bodies of text when they had the extra feet on there. And I think the reason for it is because it creates a stronger horizontal line from one text to the next bit, so that way from one word to the next word, it makes it easier to read. So usually if you're going to use this font, you're going to want to use it for large bodies of text, and usually printed. Okay, sans serif is generally it's text without those nucks on it. It's just the most plain basic text. So think of like this would be like Times New Roman. This would be like Courier. This one would be like Arial or Helvetica, if you're familiar with those. It's the most basic text. It's very simple. It's very clean. It's probably the most versatile because it is literally what it is. This one is also good for bodies of text like this one. However, this one is better if you're doing, let's say, digital stuff. So if you look at all my text here, like all in my website, I think it's all Roboto, which is a type of sans serif. The reason why it's good for digital is that these extra little feet and extra little bits here, they actually will muddy up. Because remember, they have to be represented by pixels. So when you start to make the screen really small, it actually makes the letters harder to read. As opposed to this, where I can make this text very small. and it is the most basic representation of what it would be. Now, the sans serif is not particularly visually interesting, so it's generally used for body text. That it's useful for that. You can also use this also digitally for body text as well, and you can use them both for heading. Okay, so script is the last one. Sometimes it'll be called handwritten text or cursive type. It'll be called those various things, but the idea is it's meant to imitate handwriting. Like it's supposed to look like someone wrote it. Probably an example that you would remember or that you're familiar with, Comic Sans, the most wonderful typeface that everyone loves. Comic Sans is a really common one. But basically it's supposed to look like it's written by hand. So this one is useful. It's not useful for large bodies of text, right? Because if I had a whole text written in this way, it would actually be very difficult to read. It's also, especially for digital, it's a lot more muddied up. So what you want to use this for is typically heading. You're going to see, do I talk about down here? Okay. Typically what you're going to see is you want to have text that is for headings and text for body. So when we talk about color, I said usually you want to have between 2 and 3 colors. Same thing with text. So with text, you usually want to have 2 to 3. So you're going to have your heading typeface, which is your typeface that is interesting. It draws the viewer in. It usually has a style applied to it, but it's not good for large bodies of text. It'd be difficult to read. It would strain your eyes. But it's good to draw the viewer in, okay? So this would be good for that. Body text means it's your large, it's the large amount, it's your paragraphs, it's things like that, that people are actually going to have to read over and over and over again. So there's certain fonts that work better for that, such as sans serif, and to an extent even monospace. Script would not be of that sort. That'd be good for your heading font. You can also use script for, so the third type I would say is accent text, where basically it'd be text where, if you're reading an article and they have a part that's stuck where they highlight a quote that they said and it's bigger and thinner or something, typically, where you're trying to highlight something, you might have another typeface for that as well, but it's not as necessary. So usually you're going to have the two. So script is one, and then the last one's kind of like a catch-all. That's your display font. So sometimes they'll call it decorative, fantasy font. Those are your fonts where it's like, the Goosebumps font, or like the Blood font, or like your Ransom font, where it's all the different things, Wingdings. It's your fonts that they're really difficult to read, but they're very visually interesting. So very often your heading fonts will be display fonts. Now you can get real fancy with them, or you can get less fancy with them, but that's what those ones are used for. Oh yeah, Ransom, Blood on, that's what I used for an example. Okay, but you want to use these sparingly, just because, again, as a title it's fine, but do not under any circumstance use these for body, because they will just be very difficult, depending on the one. Some of them are obviously a little more muted, while other ones are very flamboyant. So we're going to talk about applying type below, so I'm not going to really go into this, but you have your typical text tools. More than likely, this will all make sense to you when you're using inside of Photoshop, because it's not that much different than the type you would use inside of Microsoft. Okay. The last thing I want to do is, I think it's the last thing, right, is talk about the art elements and design principles. Sorry, this video is kind of long. Again, if you were going to, you might have already covered this when you were probably in high school. There are the things called the art elements and design principles. More or less what these are is they are ways of describing art. So if I'm looking at an art piece, I can describe them using these, and I can also implement these in order to try to push something visually one way or the other. Okay, so here are the art elements. So there's form. The idea of form is it's to give the illusion of it being 3D. It's kind of obvious. Line is a line. But what you need to take into account with this is that line can be more than just literally a line, because technically a line you can see is a shape, right? Because it has to have thickness. But it can also just be the outside of a shape, right? So the outside of this is actually technically a line. It can also be compositional lines where, if you follow this and then there's another object and then it will draw your eye towards a direction, right? So like a vanishing point, when you have perspective, there's lines that are drawn, even if they're not like explicitly lines. You can also have eye lines where you're looking at someone, and then if you follow their eye line, it draws you to a certain area. That's also a type of line. Color, we already kind of covered color, but I think you probably know what colors are. These are colors, okay? All the colors of the rainbow. Value is the lightness and darkness. We should have already covered that to some degree. Most of the time, what you want to have in your composition is a full range of value, meaning you want to have everything goes from pure black to pure white and all the variations in between. You do not want something that goes from gray to white or something that goes from gray to black, typically. Space, that just represents what we call positive and negative space. So there's the space that the object itself takes, and then there's the area around it. So when we talk about white space, that's negative space. Your elements that you create are taking up, so like this cone, my text and stuff, that's all taking up my positive space, and the negative space is all the area around it. It's all the white space around it. Typically, you want to have sort of a balance. It kind of depends on what you're doing, but most of the time you want to have kind of a rough balance between texture. If you were to look up the definition, it's going to say it gives a visual feel that there would be a feeling if touched. Sometimes there literally is. So like a painting, if you were to touch a painting, it does have that. But obviously this gets, you could look at this and know that if you touch that, what that would feel like. But texture, the main purpose of it really visually is that it allows us to break it up. So what I mean by that is this: if you were to look at this, you can see this very quickly. If I look at this, it takes me longer because I have to see all of the texture inside of it. So visually, this is a much slower thing to see as opposed to this. That's why when you see road signs, they are pure black and pure white or pure yellow, because you can see them very quickly. You look at just the silhouette and you understand it. This takes much longer for me to see. Sometimes that's something you want to do. You try to break up the space by using texture. Balance. So the idea is that you want to have your work visually balanced, either symmetrical or asymmetrical. This is asymmetrical balance because I have this heavier object on the bottom and this lighter one on the top, but it kind of is balanced because this is sort of making it lean this way. So it just gives it a sense of almost gravity. Even this is sort of balanced because I might have a lighter object here than this one, but then I have the heavier one here compared to this one, right? So that's balance. Contrast just means, how much variation there is between the elements here. So you can see there's not as high contrast between these two as opposed to these two, right? This is a lot darker, this is a lot lighter. You get the idea. Emphasis is the idea that you're trying to draw your eye to one specific element. So in this case, I colored this red. It draws your eye into it. The number one thing you can do to draw emphasis, you could probably think of a bunch of different things to do, right? So I could make text, like if I had text, right, I could make it larger. If I'm trying to draw it to a specific word, I can make that word larger. I can make it bolder. I could use a different font. I could change the color. But the number one thing to do if you're trying to draw an element into something is white space. If I put space around, like if I had this red and I had another object, but I had it all white around it, like all of this was blank, this actually would stand out more than even the colored object because white space is king, because everything is comparison to everything else. Movement gives the illusion of movement in an image. It helps move your eye through. Pattern just means you have the same thing happen over and over again. I think you know what a pattern is. Rhythm is the same thing as it is in music. So if you think of music, right, it's sort of a pattern, but it's a pattern with variation in it, so it changes speed as you're going through it. So you can have visual rhythm as well, where if I'm looking through something, I'll look through this part really fast, then this a little bit slower, then a little bit faster, and a little bit slower. It gives the illusion of the kind of this variation. Unity, just basically you're trying to have the elements all be cohesive, all exist as one, that they feel like they are together. Okay, so yeah, so that was the principles. Most of the time what you're usually trying to, I think I talked about this before, what you're usually trying to do is balance unity versus variety, contrast versus harmony. Okay, so for the assignment, actually I think I describe it here. So I'm not going to describe the assignment because I think, I'll just describe real quick. Basically, you're going to make two images. You're going to do an abstract image and a text-based image. For the abstract image, what I want you to do is just go out into nature. Doesn't have to be nature. Go out into the world, and I want you to take photos of things. But what I want you to do is take photos of things from interesting different perspectives. You should take the photos, and when I look at them, I don't want to know what they are. So you're not trying to take a photo of something. You're taking a photo of compositions. That's the big difference between a photographer and someone that just takes photos. Is that someone that just takes photos will take a picture of their kid, their meal, because you guys are weird. A setting sun. A photographer will take photos of compositions where they'll angle the photo a certain way and it draws your attention to this, or they'll get real close to something so you can see the texture of this, something that seems mundane and it's very visually interesting. So the idea here is that you should take photos that are abstract, that it's not about the subject matter, it's more about the visual interest of what you are capturing, both from a compositional sense but also just implementing all of these things, right? The art elements and design principles. Look for texture, try different angles, try different lighting, things like that. Just take a bunch of photos and you'll have a lot of misses, but you might have a couple of hits. The other thing you're going to do is do a text-based image. So what I want you to do is create a message, utilize the text tool, put it over top of one of your abstract photos, and play around with it. But basically you're trying to create almost like a poster. So whatever message you want it to be, it could be positive, could be negative, could be a joke. I don't really care. But you should utilize the text, and I want you to use it in a visually interesting way. All right? That's the assignment. And then I'll obviously do the project cover sheet as per usual. These are both due. Make sure you do the discussion board. Sorry for the length of this video. This is one of those ones that I think turns out pretty well. If you take it seriously, you can make something really kind of cool. So I look forward to seeing these. Good luck.